How do you feed 67 million people with farming methods that grow less food, cost significantly more to run, and expose you to far greater levels of risk? How do you keep a farm afloat on 2 tons of wheat per acre when the system that already exists pulls in 8? And when the numbers don't add up at the end of the year, who exactly is left holding that loss? I was watching BBC One during prime time. Millions of households tuned in as King Charles III laid out his vision for British agriculture. Organic methods, sustainability, working in harmony with nature, a moral imperative to fundamentally rethink how this country grows its food. The delivery was measured, the tone sincere, the language graceful. But while the king was talking in ideals, I was running calculations in my head, bills, yields, farms that can't survive on good intentions alone. Organic farming isn't a lifestyle choice you can try for a season and walk back from. It means structurally lower output, considerably higher labor costs, and a risk profile that makes conventional farming look predictable by comparison. Scale that across an entire country of 67 million people, and the mathematics gets brutal in a way that no amount of careful language can soften. I said that openly. Within an hour, more than 4 million people had seen it. Not because I said something inflammatory, because I said something true. If what actually ends up on your plate matters to you, not just what sounds good on television, then stay with me. Subscribe for farming as it genuinely operates, not as politicians choose to imagine it. After that post went viral, people immediately tried to frame this as a personal clash. It isn't. It's far more straightforward than that. King Charles and I didn't just land on opposite sides of the same debate. We came to farming from entirely different worlds. And I think it's worth being honest about exactly how different those worlds are, because that's where everything else begins. King Charles has championed organic farming for over 4 decades. His Highgrove estate in Gloucestershire started moving toward organic methods in 1985. Back then, even within farming circles, many people thought he'd lost the plot completely. He later said himself that colleagues considered him a complete idiot for wanting to farm without chemicals, but he pushed forward anyway. He converted the 900-acre home farm to a fully organic system and built the entire Duchy Originals brand out of it, what is now the UK's largest organic food brand, sold through Waitrose under the Duchy Organic label. For Charles, farming is about stewardship over centuries, not quarters. Long horizons, big principles. The land as an inheritance to be passed forward in better condition than you found it. I arrived at farming from the complete opposite end. In 2019, I bought Diddley Squat Farm in Oxfordshire and found out very quickly that the reality of farming is nothing like the image. No generational wealth tied up in the land. No safety net. Just weather that does what it wants. Bills that arrive on schedule regardless. Machinery that breaks at precisely the worst moment. And crops that either grow or don't. There's no buffer. No estate staff to absorb the costs. No brand-generating revenue while you wait out a bad year. At Diddley Squat, farming isn't a philosophy. It's a daily question of what works versus what doesn't, and whether you're still operating next spring. Neither starting point is wrong. But serious problems emerge the moment one vision gets treated as universally applicable, particularly when the people absorbing the consequences are already operating on the edge. The moment this stopped being a values debate and became something far more urgent was when the talk started shifting toward actual policy. In 2023, King Charles gave a speech laying out his vision for the future of British agriculture. The direction was clear: step away from chemical-intensive methods, embrace organic principles, rethink the entire relationship between farming and the natural world. The language was careful. The room responded well. Environmental organizations were enthusiastic. And almost immediately, that vision began pulling policy levers in one very specific direction. Incentives for organic conversion were put on the table. Restrictions on certain pesticides and synthetic fertilizers were floated. Regulatory frameworks started moving toward principles that sounded environmentally admirable but carried enormous practical implications that nobody in the speeches bothered to spell out. That's when I became genuinely worried. Not because I have some attachment to chemicals, but because I'd already walked parts of that road myself. I knew what wasn't in the speeches. The yield drops you can't explain away. The labor bills that climb as soon as you remove the tools that kept pest and disease manageable. The crop losses that don't get photographed for the campaign materials. The fields that look exactly as they should from the road and produce almost nothing at harvest. On paper, organic farming presents itself as a logical, achievable alternative. In practice, when margins are already razor thin, it behaves like a system designed for people who can absorb the losses while they wait for it to stabilize. And here's the critical point. When policy is designed around theory rather than field experience, the risk doesn't land on the ministers who wrote the framework. It doesn't land on the advisors who shaped it. It doesn't land on the campaigners who cheered it. It lands on the farmers. That was the moment this shifted from a debate about values into a question of survival. Because once ideals become rules, someone has to pay for them, and it is almost never the people who wrote them. Rather than continuing to argue about it in the abstract, I decided to do the most straightforward thing possible. I'd try it myself, on my own land, properly, with no shortcuts. At Diddly Squat, I sectioned off a test field and followed the organic rulebook as carefully as I could manage. No synthetic chemicals, no artificial fertilizers, no pesticide safety net, just the approach that's supposed to work. In the early weeks, the field genuinely looked good, tidy, green, the kind of visual that makes for a strong Instagram post. But farming has never been about appearances. It's about the number that comes in at harvest. When we got those numbers, they removed any ambiguity from the argument. The organic wheat produced roughly 2 tons per acre. The conventional field, sitting immediately next to it, same soil type, identical weather, same farmer, produced approximately 8 tons per acre, 4 times the output on the same land. And the yield gap wasn't the only cost. Every problem on the organic plot took more time to identify, more labor to manage, and more money to attempt to fix, with far less certainty that the fix would actually work. Pests and disease, when they arrive without the standard intervention tools, don't just reduce your yield slightly. They can take out entire sections of a crop before you've found a workable response. We put all of it on camera, every result honestly reported, because once you see numbers like those laid out next to each other, this stops being an argument about philosophy. It becomes a practical reality check. Fields don't respond to sincerity. They respond to what actually works. When that episode aired, I wasn't expecting it to trigger a national argument, but it did. Around 20 million people watched it, and organic farming suddenly wasn't a niche agricultural discussion anymore. It was prime time. It was in the newspapers. It was all over social media. And predictably, the country started dividing itself into camps. Environmental groups were sharp in their criticism. They argued I was oversimplifying, that I was defending the chemical agriculture industry, that I was ignoring long-term soil health, biodiversity benefits, and what organic farming was actually trying to achieve across a full crop rotation cycle. And to be fair, on the question of what organic farming aspires to do, some of those points have genuine weight. Organic systems, over time and on suitable land, can deliver measurable improvements in soil biology, biodiversity, and water retention. The ambition isn't fictional. But then a different kind of response started arriving. Farmers, quietly at first, then in numbers too large to ignore. The message was nearly uniform. Thank you for saying what we've been living with. They recognized those yield figures because they'd seen them on their own land. They recognized the cost structure because they'd paid it. Farming unions brought their own data to the conversation. The core finding, if Britain moved aggressively toward organic production across its farmland, national food output could fall by somewhere in the region of 40%. That figure isn't a rhetorical point. That's a food security emergency for a country that already imports a substantial portion of what it eats, and where food production per person has actually declined since 2000 even without any policy-driven yield reductions. To put that in sharper context, the UK's average conventional wheat yield sits at around 8.5 tons per hectare. Organic systems, by the most generous independent assessments, typically come in between 18 and 25% lower on average across all crop types. Some studies put the gap wider, depending on crop and conditions. 2 tons per acre versus 8 isn't an anomaly. It's a magnified version of a gap that exists across the entire system. And Britain is already in a position where domestic food production covers only around 60% of total consumption in some categories. The room for error is not large. At that point, this stopped being about me or about King Charles. It became something wider, a fracture line between urban environmental optimism and rural economic reality. Idealism on one side, arithmetic on the other. Nobody was screaming yet, but everyone was picking a side. And once farming becomes a culture war, the numbers don't disappear. They just get buried under noise. By mid-2024, the tone began to change in a way I hadn't expected. Until then, the disagreement had been about methods and measurable outcomes. Then it became something more pointed. In an interview, King Charles spoke about the farming sector needing a moral reset. He suggested some people remained locked in outdated ways of thinking, treating agriculture as nothing more than a commercial exercise. My name wasn't mentioned. It didn't need to be. I understood the sentiment. From his position, farming should carry an obligation that goes beyond profit margins, a responsibility to the land, to biodiversity, to the people who'll inherit what we leave behind. That's a view I don't dismiss. The problem is, what happens when moral framing enters the conversation without any corresponding honesty about who actually pays for the transition? When you tell a farmer they must change how they operate, you're simultaneously telling them to accept lower income, higher costs, and greater exposure to risk, often for years before any stabilization occurs. You're asking them to carry a burden on behalf of a principle that was designed elsewhere by people who don't face the same consequences. Around that same period, a cluster of independent research was starting to confirm what the farm-level experience already showed. Yield reductions under organic management averaged around 20 to 25% when measured across varied crop types and conditions. That doesn't make organic farming irredeemably bad, but it makes it structurally difficult, and when you're already operating on margins thin enough that a single bad harvest can threaten the entire business, those percentages aren't abstract. They're the difference between staying open and not. I responded publicly. Not with anger, but with the same directness I'd try to bring to anything. It's considerably easier to speak about moral obligation when your land isn't carrying a mortgage, when your income doesn't depend on whether the harvest actually delivers, when your family's financial security isn't attached to the field's output. It's harder when the consequences are yours to absorb. That was the real fault line in this debate. One side was speaking in values, the other was speaking in numbers. Both believed they were right. Only one of them had to face the results when the calculation didn't work. By early 2025, the debate stopped being theoretical. The policies weren't proposals anymore. They were rules, and rules have consequences that show up in the real world whether or not anyone planned for them carefully. Near Diddley Squat, 3 family farms announced they were shutting down. Not because those farmers were indifferent to their land, not because they'd managed their operations carelessly, because they couldn't absorb the cost of regulatory compliance on margins that were already unsustainable. New equipment requirements, new administrative burdens, new restrictions that added layers of cost and risk to operations that had no financial padding to accommodate them. These weren't abstracted case studies. These were specific farms, specific families, specific livelihoods, gone. And it wasn't just the organic policy pressures. The broader picture for British farming in this period was genuinely alarming. In November 2024, the Labour government's budget introduced changes to agricultural inheritance tax, what became quickly known in farming circles as the tractor tax. Under the new rules, farms valued above £1 million would become subject to inheritance tax at 20% on the excess, potentially forcing heirs to sell farmland to cover the bill. For a sector where farmers are routinely described as asset-rich but cash-poor, sitting on land that's worth millions but generating modest income, the prospect of a forced sale to cover an inherited tax liability felt like an existential threat. The National Farmers Union estimated that 75% of commercial farm businesses fell within scope of the change. Thousands of farmers descended on Westminster in November 2024, and again with hundreds of tractors in December, to make clear that this wasn't a fringe concern. By this point, something had shifted. The argument had moved well past organic versus conventional. It had become a wider reckoning between a sector that was being asked to simultaneously become more environmentally responsible, absorb new tax obligations, and remain financially viable, all at the same time, all without a credible bridge between where it was and where policy wanted it to go. That's when I did what felt like the only thing that made sense. I invited farmers to the pub attached to Diddley Squat. No cameras to start with, no media agenda, just a room. About 300 farmers came, some frustrated, some visibly exhausted, some carrying the kind of quiet fear that doesn't make for good television, but is very real when you see it in person. What they said, when they finally had a room and people who'd listen, was consistent. The decisions affecting their futures were being made by people who had never sat with a balance sheet, wondering which payment to defer, who had never lain awake calculating whether this harvest would cover what last season couldn't. I spoke that night without notes, not as someone with a television audience or a farm tourism operation or any particular agenda, but as someone who had made expensive mistakes on his own land, lost money I didn't have to lose, and come close enough to genuine failure to understand what that pressure actually feels like. The footage went online. Around 5 million people watched it. I said what I believed to be true, and still believe: King Charles farms organically on land that has belonged to the crown for generations. No mortgage attached to it, no commercial lending pressure. A dedicated estate team, a brand, Duchy Organic, that generates income independently of whether any individual season performs. That's not a character attack. That's simply the context, and the context matters enormously when you're talking about what farming should be required to do. The farming experience you have when you have all of that is not the same experience as the one most farmers in this country actually have. And when that distinction gets flattened out, when policy is written as though every farm operates on the same risk profile, the gap between intention and consequence becomes catastrophic. When actual farms start closing down, theory stops being a comfortable place to live. By the time all of this had run its course, the thing that became clearest to me was that this was never really about winning a debate. It was about two fundamentally different accounts of what farming is supposed to be, and what it's supposed to cost, and who's supposed to bear that cost. King Charles's view is coherent and comes from a genuine place: farming as environmental stewardship. Success measured in soil health over decades, biodiversity across the whole estate, the land left in better condition than it was found. From inside that framework, accepting shorter-term financial strain in exchange for long-term environmental gain doesn't just seem reasonable, it seems like the obvious choice. The only responsible one. My view is different, and I think the difference matters. For me, the definition of a successful farm is harsher and more immediate. Does the crop actually grow? Does the business remain solvent at year-end? Can the land continue to produce food for another generation without the family that runs it going under? Because a farm that collapses under the weight of well-intentioned policy doesn't protect the environment. It abandons the land to whatever comes next. Usually developers or institutional investors with no particular attachment to keeping it agricultural at all. A third of UK farmland is already under some form of development pressure, according to recent projections, with estimates suggesting that under current trajectories, 23% of farmland could disappear entirely by 2050. Idealism that accelerates that process isn't environmentalism, it's its opposite. Both positions come from genuine concern. Both want a workable future for British food and British land. The difficulty is that they don't fit together neatly, and the people paying the price for that gap are not the people who designed it. You cannot ask farmers to carry the full economic burden of a moral agenda built somewhere else without also being honest about what happens when they can't. You cannot protect the environment by making it financially impossible for the people who work it to remain viable. These are not ideological positions. They're arithmetic ones, and the arithmetic doesn't improve because the intentions behind it are sincere. That's where Britain sits now. One side talking about what farming should become, the other counting costs, watching yields, and in some cases, closing operations that have been running for generations. Neither side feels heard. Neither is backing down. The gap between conscience and calculation hasn't closed. Maybe the future this country actually needs requires both of those things working together. Proper care for the land as a living system, but also honest acknowledgement of the economic realities that determine whether the people who work that land can stay on it. Care for soil health, yes, but also working policy that doesn't price real farming out of existence before the idealism has had time to deliver any of its promised benefits. Until those two things meet somewhere in the middle, until the people who write the rules have to live with the consequences of them, and until the people living those consequences get a genuine seat in the room where the rules get written, this argument won't resolve. Not because anyone wants it to continue, but because the gap between what farming is imagined to be and what it actually is remains too wide for one side to simply defer to the other. This was never really about a king and a television presenter disagreeing on camera. It's about what ends up on your plate, and who's left farming by the time it gets there. If you want to follow this story and hear farming explained as it actually operates, not as ministers imagine it from a conference room, subscribe to the channel. The decisions being made right now about British agriculture will directly determine what this country eats in 10 years' time. And most of those decisions are happening without the people most affected in the room. Thanks for watching.